Close your eyes for a moment and picture a city of 1 million souls. Not in the age of skyscrapers and electric light, but in a world where the fastest way to send a message was a man on a horse, where surgery was performed without anesthesia, and where gods supposedly walked among mortals. Now, imagine that this city, sprawling, chaotic, magnificent, controlled the fate of roughly 60 million people stretched across 3 continents. From the fog-drenched moors of northern Britain to the sun-scorched sands of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the banks of the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. This was Rome in the 2nd century. And what happened inside its walls during those 100 years was so extraordinary, so improbable, so dense with genius and contradiction, that the 18th century historian Edward Gibbon would later call it the period in which the human race was most happy and prosperous. He may have been right. He may also have been catastrophically wrong. But to understand why, you need to walk with me through the streets of the most powerful city the ancient world ever produced, at the exact moment it believed it would last forever. To grasp what Rome was in the 2nd century, you first need to feel the weight of what came before it. By the year 100 AD, Rome was already ancient by any standard. The traditional founding date of 753 BC meant the city had been a continuous settlement for over 800 years. When the 2nd century dawned, Rome had already survived the chaos of the late Republic, the assassination of Julius Caesar, the paranoid reign of Tiberius, and the madness of Caligula, the Great Fire under Nero, and the brutal civil war of 69 AD that saw 4 emperors in a single year. It had endured plagues, famines, and the destruction of Pompeii just 2 decades earlier. And yet, here it stood, not merely surviving, but thriving on a scale that no civilization on Earth could rival. The empire covered approximately 5 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the entire European Union today. Its road network stretched over 400,000 kilometers, enough to circle the planet 10 times. And at the center of this web of stone and ambition sat Rome itself, a city unlike anything the world had seen or would see again for over 1,000 years. If you could somehow be transported to the Rome of Emperor Trajan around the year 110 AD, the first thing that would strike you would not be the grandeur. It would be the noise. Rome was deafeningly, relentlessly loud. The poet Juvenal, who lived during this exact period, complained bitterly about the racket, the creak of wagon wheels on stone at dawn, the shouts of vendors selling everything from garum fish sauce to exotic perfumes from Arabia, the clang of blacksmiths, the barking of dogs, the chanting of priests, the occasional roar from the Colosseum when 50,000 spectators watched a gladiator fall. The streets of the Subura, a dense, tangled district of tenement buildings called insulae, were narrow enough that you could lean out of a 4th-floor window and nearly shake hands with your neighbor across the alley. These buildings rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high, built cheaply from wood and brick, and they collapsed or caught fire with terrifying regularity. The satirist Martial joked darkly that his apartment was so high up, he lived closer to the gods than to the street. But step out of the Subura and walk south toward the Forum, and the scale of what Rome had built would stop you in your tracks. The Roman Forum by the 2nd century was not a single building, but a cascading landscape of temples, basilicas, triumphal arches, and public spaces layered over centuries of construction. The Temple of Saturn held the state treasury. The Rostra, the great speaking platform, was where orators like Cicero had once shaped the fate of nations with nothing but their voice. And towering above it all, visible from nearly every point in the city, was the Capitoline Hill, crowned by the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, in the spiritual heart of Roman power. But if the old Forum was the soul of Rome, the new imperial forums were its flexing muscles. Trajan's Forum, completed around 112 AD and designed by the brilliant architect Apollodorus of Damascus, included a vast public square, 2 libraries, the enormous Basilica Ulpia, and at its center, Trajan's Column, a masterpiece spiraling upward for 38 meters, depicting in exquisite carved relief the emperor's military campaigns in Dacia. The column contained over 2,600 individual human figures. If you unrolled the carved band, it would stretch for approximately 200 meters. It was a movie carved in stone. the ancient world's most ambitious attempt at visual storytelling. But the true engine of Rome's second-century greatness was not its monuments. It was its system. And that system rested on several interlocking pillars that created something no previous civilization had achieved: a functional, multi-ethnic superstate that could govern territories separated by months of travel and generate wealth on a scale not matched until the Industrial Revolution. The first pillar was the military. The Roman legions numbered approximately 300,000 professional soldiers, stationed along the empire's vast frontiers. These were career soldiers who served for 25 years, trained to a level of discipline that made them the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. A single legion could march 30 kilometers in a day in full armor, build a fortified camp every evening, and dismantle it by dawn. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, begun in 122 AD, it stretched 117 kilometers from coast to coast. It was not merely a defensive barrier, it was a statement of permanent intent. The second pillar was infrastructure. The aqueduct system that supplied Rome was a marvel that defies easy comprehension. 11 major aqueducts fed the city, carrying an estimated 1 million cubic meters of fresh water every single day, roughly 1,000 liters per person. That is a figure many modern cities struggle to match. The water supplied over 1,000 public fountains, dozens of enormous bathhouses, and the industrial operations that kept the city functioning. The Aqua Traiana, completed around 109 AD, tapped springs near Lake Bracciano, 40 kilometers northwest of Rome. These aqueducts were precision-engineered channels maintaining a gradient sometimes as gentle as 1 meter drop per kilometer, running through tunnels bored through mountains and across valleys on soaring stone arcades. The Pont du Gard in southern France stood nearly 50 meters tall and was constructed without mortar. Its massive limestone blocks held together by nothing but their own weight and the precision of their cutting. It is still standing. The third pillar was commerce. The port of Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, handled an astonishing volume of trade: grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, silk from China, spices from India, ivory from Africa, tin from Britain. Rome imported roughly 400,000 tons of grain annually just to feed its population. The Annona, the state grain distribution, provided free bread to roughly 200,000 citizens. As Juvenal memorably put it, the Roman populace cared for only two things: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. But behind this cynical observation lay a logistical achievement of breathtaking complexity. To feed a city of 1 million people in an age before refrigeration required a supply chain, stretching thousands of kilometers across the Mediterranean and operating with a reliability that would impress a modern logistics company. The fourth pillar was law. Roman law in the 2nd century was the most sophisticated legal system in the ancient world. The concept of innocent until proven guilty, the right to a legal defense, the distinction between civil and criminal law, all trace their lineage directly to Roman jurisprudence. Under Hadrian, the Juris Salvius Julianus compiled the Edictum Perpetuum, a permanent consolidation of magisterial edicts creating a unified body of legal precedent. This meant a merchant in Londinium could enter into a contract with a supplier in Antioch, and both could expect the same legal principles to apply. In a world without instant communication, this legal consistency was the invisible glue that held the empire together. And this brings us to the men who sat at the apex of this extraordinary machine, the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Their consecutive reigns from 96 to 180 AD represent what many historians consider the golden age of imperial Rome. And the remarkable thing is that 4 of these 5 came to power, not through birth, but through adoption. Then each emperor chose his successor based on merit, not bloodline. Nerva set the precedent by adopting Trajan, a proven military commander from Hispania who had no blood relation to him. Trajan was reportedly succeeded by Hadrian under somewhat murky circumstances. Ancient sources disagree on whether the adoption was genuine or fabricated by Trajan's wife Plotina on the emperor's deathbed. Whatever the truth, Hadrian proved extraordinary. Where Trajan had been a conqueror, expanding the empire to its greatest territorial extent, Hadrian was a consolidator. He traveled more extensively than any emperor before or after, visiting nearly every province over his 21-year reign. He was a polymath, architect, poet, hunter, administrator, but also volatile and capable of cruelty. His relationship with the young Greek Antinous, a Nunu who drowned mysteriously in the Nile in 130 AD, led to a grief so consuming that Hadrian deified the boy and founded a city in his name, Antinopolis, on the spot where he died. It remains one of the most extraordinary acts of personal mourning in the history of leadership. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, whose 23-year reign was so peaceful, so remarkably uneventful, that historians struggle to fill books about him. And that, paradoxically, is the highest compliment. But the man who would follow Antoninus, the man who inherited the most powerful position on earth at the height of its power, was also the man whose reign would mark the beginning of Rome's long, slow decline. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and his story is one of the most poignant in human history. Marcus did not want to be emperor, and he wanted to be a philosopher. His private journal, known today as the Meditations, was never intended for publication. Notes to himself written in Greek, often composed late at night in a military tent on some frozen frontier. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," he wrote. "Realize this, and you will find strength." These words have survived for nearly 2,000 years. But the bitter irony is that this philosopher-emperor spent nearly his entire reign at war, against the Parthians in the east, against Germanic tribes crashing across the Danube, and against something far worse than any barbarian army. In 165 AD, Roman soldiers returning from Mesopotamia brought something back with them. It was not gold or glory, it was disease. The Antonine Plague swept through the empire with devastating speed. Modern scholars believe it was likely smallpox. At its peak, it may have killed 2,000 people per day in Rome alone. Over its 15-year course, it killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people, perhaps 7 to 10% of the total population. Entire legions were decimated. Agricultural production collapsed. The physician Galen, who witnessed it firsthand, reported patients suffering from fever, diarrhea, and a distinctive skin eruption he described with clinical precision but obvious horror. And Marcus Aurelius had to watch his empire hemorrhage while simultaneously fighting wars on multiple fronts. He raised taxes, debased the currency, sold imperial furniture to fund the legions, and personally led campaigns along the Danube in freezing conditions. He never broke, but his world was breaking around him. And here is where the invisible fracture lines of Rome's greatness become visible. Because beneath the marble and the aqueducts, the empire was built on a foundation that modern eyes would find deeply disturbing. Between 20 and 30% of the population of Roman Italy consisted of enslaved people. Slaves worked in the mines of Hispania under conditions so brutal that life expectancy was measured in months. Slaves rowed the galleys, built the roads, cleaned the sewers, educated the children, and satisfied the desires of their owners. Some achieved positions of influence, but they remained property, bought, sold, beaten, and killed at their owner's discretion. And the gladiatorial games were, beneath the spectacle, a mechanized system of human slaughter. Trajan's celebration of his Dacian victory reportedly featured games lasting 123 days, during which roughly 11,000 animals were killed and 10,000 gladiators fought. The sand of the arena floor was specially designed to absorb blood. The bathhouses reveal the same contradiction. The baths of Trajan on the Oppian Hill covered an area equivalent to 10 modern football fields, offering heated pools, cold plunge baths, steam rooms, gymnasiums, and libraries. Admission was free or negligible. The water was heated by hypocausts that circulated hot air beneath raised floors, central heating not surpassed in Europe until the 19th century. But the furnaces were stoked by slaves, the pipes were made of lead, and the sanitation, while impressive by ancient standards, was profoundly inadequate. The Tiber downstream was essentially an open sewer. Diseases like typhoid and malaria were endemic. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Average life expectancy at birth hovered between 25 and 35 years. The gleaming facades hid a city that killed its poorest residents with casual efficiency. But The most significant tension was one few could perceive, between the system's success and its inherent fragility. The adoptive succession that produced the 5 good emperors was not a constitutional mechanism. It was an accident. Each emperor happened to lack biological sons. Marcus Aurelius had a son. His name was Commodus, and Marcus broke the chain. The results were disastrous. Commodus was everything his father was not: impulsive, vain, erratic. He fought as a gladiator in the arena, and renamed the months after his own titles, renamed Rome itself. He was assassinated on New Year's Eve 192 AD, strangled by a wrestler named Narcissus, and his death plunged the empire into civil war. The Golden Age was over, and it had ended not because of invasion or economic collapse, but because of a father's love for an unworthy son. The ripples of Rome's zenith extended far beyond its borders and its time. The cities the Romans built shaped Europe permanently. London, Paris, Vienna, Budapest, Istanbul all began as Roman settlements. Latin fractured into the Romance languages spoken today by nearly 1 billion people. Roman legal principles underpin most Western civil codes. When Thomas Jefferson designed the Virginia state capitol, he modeled it on a Roman temple in Nimes. When the framers of the Constitution created the Senate, they named it after the Roman Senatus. The gravitational pull of the 2nd century empire warped the trajectory of everything that came after. And yet, standing on the Palatine Hill in the year 160 AD, you would have had no reason to believe this would ever end. The empire had survived everything. It had absorbed defeats and turned them into victories. It had built a civilization so confident in its own permanence that the idea of its fall would have seemed inconceivable. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of Rome's Golden Age. Not that great civilizations fall, every schoolchild learns that, but that they fall while believing themselves eternal. The Antonine Plague killed millions, but the empire survived. The Danube Wars strained the legions, but the frontier held. Each crisis was weathered, each wound was patched, and each patch made the system a little more brittle, a little less resilient, a little more dependent on the next competent emperor, the next favorable harvest, the next stroke of luck. The margins grew thinner until eventually there were no margins left at all. There is a passage in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius writes something that has haunted readers for almost 2,000 years. Think of the universal substance, of which you have a very small portion, and of universal time, of which a short and indivisible interval has been assigned to you. He was writing about the insignificance of the individual, but he might as well have been writing about Rome itself. The Forum is now a field of broken columns, visited by tourists who photograph ruins they barely understand. The Colosseum is a hollow shell, not colonized by wildflowers and feral cats. The aqueducts stand in fragments, their arches framing empty sky. But the ideas, the law, the language, the roads, the concept of a republic, the notion that power should serve the public good, those survived. They were passed down through the chaos of the Middle Ages, rediscovered during the Renaissance, and embedded in the constitutions that govern billions today. Every time you walk into a courtroom, every time you cross a bridge built on an arch, every time you speak a language descended from Latin, you are walking through the long shadow of Rome's 2nd century. So the next time someone tells you that Rome fell, remember this. Rome did not fall. Rome transformed. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and those pieces became the foundations of the world we live in now. We are all, in some sense, still living in the ruins of Rome. And the question that Marcus Aurelius could never quite answer, whether reason and duty are enough to hold back the tide of chaos, is a question we are still asking in every courtroom, every parliament, every late-night conversation about whether the center can hold. The stones crumble, the ideas endure, and the argument between order and entropy, between ambition and fragility, between the dream of permanence and the reality of time, that argument never ends. It just changes language. I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.